This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon. Or maybe you've already had your copy. Read it carefully. It tells you what the new National Health Service is and how you can use what it offers. Hospitals and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances, care of the teeth, care of the eyes, maternity services, home health services. The new scheme starts on July the 5th. But there's one thing you should do at once. Choose your doctor now. That's most important. Study the leaflet, then keep it by you. You'll need it for reference. The new National Health Service starts, providing hospital and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances, care of the teeth and eyes, maternity services. Ask your doctor now if he'll look after you under the new scheme. If he can't accept you, ask at the post office for the address of the Executive Council, where you'll be given the names of other doctors in your area who are taking part in the new service. Ask the doctor you choose for an application form for each member of your family. One form has to be filled in for each member of the family and then handed over to your doctor. Now don't forget, choose your doctor now.
Our plan is a service which will provide the best medical advice and treatment for everyone, every man, woman and child in this country. It'll cover any medicines you may need, specialist advice, and of course hospital treatment, whatever the illness. Special care for mothers and children, and a lot of other things besides. In fact, every kind of advice and treatment you may need. Now all the details are set out in this white paper and in a shorter pamphlet. And you'll find there the arrangement the government proposed for the doctors, the hospitals, the local authorities and so on.
Doctor, how do you feel about this personally?
Well, my own feeling, and I think the feeling of most general practitioners, is one of frustration and disillusionment. We just feel let down. Certain promises were made to us when we came into the National Health Service in 1948, and they simply haven't been kept. We are going to have to limit the developments in the way of extra staff, extra equipment, improving premises, which has been going on steadily.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I'm Michael Brooks, and we are broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Head theoretician David Griscom.
How's it going?
It is the week of the 70th anniversary of the National Health Service. Great human accomplishment, one of the greatest accomplishments of the 20th century, and a handful of doctors bleeding and whining was happening back then too, even as that health service went on to deliver in a globally recognized way.
We're going to have to ignore the same sort of bleeding, shall we call it?
Exactly. We're going to have to ignore exactly the same sort of bleeding as we march forward to cover every single person in this country with universal government health care as we move forward and win. On this week's program, Harvey J. Kaye. He is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's author of The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. We're talking about American radicalism, the Supreme Court versus democracy, and what the Four Freedoms means for all of us, plus a new radical right nominee for the Supreme Court by Donald Trump. But this nominee is not of Trump. He is of Harvard and Yale and the elite industrial complex, which has done so much through the courts and every other institution to claw back rights and entrench oligarchy in this society. Is the resistance up for taking him down? Well, I was going to say we'll see, but unfortunately we probably won't. We probably already know the outcome. Plus, Theresa May's grip on power, very shaky. Jeremy Corbyn, that boy, he's getting closer to number 10. We'll break that down. All that, plus Griscom's Economic Minute, Noam Chomsky on the Powell Memo, which explains so much of where we are politically and socially today. All that and much, much more on the Michael Brooks Show. But first, let's go to Latin America, where there was an intense drama in Brazil over this past weekend. On Saturday, a Brazilian judge ordered the immediate release of former President Lula da Silva. That ruling was not complied with by the prosecutor slash judge, Judge Moro, who put Lula in jail, a far-right aligned judge who has used an anti-corruption campaign in Brazil, which has been going on for several years, as clearly part of a broader structural attack on former President Dilma and President Lula and the broader left in Brazil. He refused to release Lula from prison. We're seeing some footage of Lula in a moment. He refused to release Lula from prison. And also then another judge intervened and reinstated Lula's sentence. So Lula remains in prison, even as many took to the streets to call for and demand his release. We've also seen other stories in Latin America. There's an Interpol warrant for former President Rafael Correa in Ecuador. There's corruption allegations hovering over Cristina Kirchner in Argentina. And of course, in Venezuela, the Nicolas Maduro's Chavismo government remains embattled. Now, there's a bigger context for all of this, and this unfortunately sort of sees this is the sort of culmination of the pink tide of governments which began taking power in the late 90s in Latin America and sort of reached its peak in 2015. But we're also talking about people obviously like Hugo Chavez, who we're seeing here, Lula da Silva, the Kirchners in Argentina, as well as leaders in Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, and Guatemala. Now, did some of these leaders make their own mistakes, create their own problems? Yes, they certainly did. And of course, also Evo Morales, who still governs in Bolivia. Yes, they did. And they also represented very different models of governance, some with authoritarian populist leanings, some with moderate social democratic leanings. What all of them share, and to different degrees as failures in some respects, was actually not continuing to actively mobilize a social base as they governed. This was a problem even in Venezuela, where there's a very mixed record. In some areas, in some provinces, that has actually been done very successfully under Chavez, and others it's devolved to patronage and corruption. Whereas in other countries and other pink tide governments did not. They sort of relied on an exclusive electoral strategy. Electoral politics is essential, but the left can never govern without a powerful social base. Also, we need to be real about the reality that this pushback against them, and particularly in the case of Brazil, just in a couple of senses. One, that the evidence against Lula is so flimsy. The impeachment with Dilma was so ridiculous and done on a technicality. And this is all happening in the context of a current president, Temer, instituting a massively unpopular austerity program where he has himself been caught on tape talking about delivering bribes. So that's the context in Brazil. President Lula was arguably the most successful president on the planet in the aughts, in the 2003 from 2012 period in which he governed. He lifted at least 30 million, between 20 and 30 million people out of poverty and reasserted Brazil's role in the world, including in ways that set actually the precursor for the Iran agreement that President Obama and his partners would sign with Iran several years later. And he did this in a way that did not in any way threaten the traditional Brazilian oligarchs and elite. And in fact, that's why the only legitimate critiques of President Lula come from the left that was concerned about certain lacks of structural reform. So if the Brazilian oligarchs are willing to implement a lawfare coup on someone like Lula, who generated a win-win for everybody, except for parts of his own social base at times, that underscores the profound state of threat and counter-revolution that Latin America is in a state of right now, obviously with the exception of Mexico. Going back historically, we know that in the 1970s and the early 1980s, there were the Condor years. Right-wing junta governments across Latin America coordinated across borders with U.S. support and U.S. training and U.S. aid to murder leftists across the continent. Governments that ran Brazil, Argentina, and Chile shared intelligence, collaborated in death squads, and murdered thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people with any type of leftward perspective, whether they be guerrillas or journalists. Now, some, like John Oliver, would have you believe that this type of politics is in the distant past and the modern reality of Latin America doesn't share any of those characteristics. And yes, some of those characteristics are really quite different. There isn't a Condor years in Latin America, but there is an Atlas network. And the Atlas network, which as reported recently in 2007 in The Intercept, is a libertarian-backed think tank which has dispersed $5 million in Latin America and receives Koch brothers funding. It has received support and coordinated with the State Department, the National Endowment of Democracy, and has been involved with the Free Brazil movement, the Foundation Eletoria in Honduras. Of course, in 2009, the military-backed coup against the center-left leader Manuel Zelaya in Honduras with the backing of Hillary Clinton's State Department and the Obama administration was in so many respects the precursor of what we've seen across the region. They were involved in that. In Brazil, the Brazilian movement was modeled in some respects after the Tea Party and has a strong libertarian, read fascist influence. James O'Keefe has spent time teaching the people involved in these movements through the Atlas Network how to use his techniques in their endeavors to undermine left governance. The co-founder of the Atlas Network, a think tank, and I'm quoting now from the Intercept, a think tank Instituto Millennium Constantino has been dubbed the Breitbart of Brazil. Constantino is credited with popularizing the narrative that the Workers' Party supporters are limousine liberals, wealthy hypocrites that flock to socialism to claim the moral high ground while snubbing the working classes they claim to represent. So the techniques, the methodologies change, the propaganda outlets change, but the same dynamics that saw the mass murder of the left with CIA support. In fact, the stat that I understand from Latin America that has been validated by many researchers is that there's only one country in the hemisphere that has not had a U.S.-backed coup institute a right-wing government, and that's Costa Rica. Every single other place, and of course they've tried but failed in Cuba, every single other Latin American state has been on the receiving end of violent U.S. foreign policy, and now Koch brother propaganda coordinated with U.S. foreign policy as well. In Brazil, there's a mass austerity regime and an imprisonment of a leader who would win this election in an absolute violation of democracy. In Venezuela, there are self-generated and serious problems created by the Chavez government and by Nicolas Maduro's failed leadership. There's also an endless campaign of CIA harassment, outward propaganda, right-wing oligarchs who have opposed with every step of the way the achievements that were put into place in the early part of the Chavismo period, which did redirect oil revenue into needed social programs and did empower certain communities. The reality of what's happening in Latin America today does not require any idealization of the pink tide, but it does require a contextualization that the United States is never going to be comfortable with, and the oligarchs of the hemisphere are never even going to support even the most modest manifestations of reversing the structural inequities of capitalism and feudalism as practiced in hemispheric politics. And that's why we need to have solidarity with the left in Latin America. That's why even in places and countries and governments where we might have the most criticisms of, our first and foremost obligation is to oppose U.S. corporate and governmental interference in the region. And we need to understand also, in the places where there was success, the limits of that model and what we need to do going forward. Salvador Allende was a great hero, and Chile could have turned into one of the most successful countries in the planet under his leadership. And the conditions he governed under were very, very complicated. And the conditions for a sort of larger instigation and revolution were definitely not necessarily in place there at all. So he was under extreme pressure, and he did get elected through traditional democratic means, and he wanted to preserve those means. Now, on the other hand, Fidel Castro is reported to have told Allende, and Castro was very pragmatic. Castro spoke positively of what Lula did in Brazil. He's obviously quite supportive of Venezuela, but he didn't demand one model at all for the hemisphere. But he is said to have told Allende, before the coup happened, you need to get guns to the workers in the factories. You need to have a street arm, a labor arm that will defend you because they're coming. And sadly, Allende didn't do it. And that was where the failure to coordinate and take a full-scale approach came through, with tragic consequences in the U.S.-backed coup of Augusto Pinochet and the mass murder that, of course, ended Allende's life and tens of thousands of others after. So our obligation is solidarity, critical analysis of everyone, and opposition to our interference there, period. Lula libre. You guys, this is the new, more decentralized approach, where I do the upfront comment. I
feel like we could use some Pusha T.
Oh yeah, I'm with it. Just bed. I'm. If you want to bed anything with Pusha T, But I want your thoughts on this, because I think that, especially if you look at the Atlas Network, the similarities between the propaganda that has been beamed outward is actually now what is used at home. And it's very important, I think, to, it's another dialectic, actually. How do you not fall into idealizing and glossing over the failures of say, an Ortega or a Maduro, while also recognizing the fact that they are still the targets of our interference in foreign policy, which is, in fact, I think, as people who are Americans, our primary obligation to respond to.
The first thing I'll just comment on briefly is I think it's instructive from a sort of anti-U.S. imperialism standpoint to notice that, like, fascism has actually an organic, deep root in a lot of these countries.
Yep.
It could be. It's interesting. Like, I don't think America, in this since the Cold War has started, has had like the Bernie Sanders thing, right? Like, if Bernie somehow won the presidency, that'd be such a mind fuck for any other country that spent the last. Any time in the last 50 years trying to move left, America's just going to do this. This guy would have been shot in our country.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it is interesting and kind of terrifying and depressing to see how actually it's not just the CIA that's doing this stuff too.
Not at all.
Right. The right wing is global and everywhere, basically. Like the global intelligence, all that shit is terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Matt completely. That's one of the lessons that I feel like we need to take from the past 100 years of struggle, honestly, is that the right actually has a very astute understanding of politics and how to win political power. And it's a real shame that the left does, in today's time, does not have a strong kind of international movement where people of the left wing can gather and work together. And, we can try to build those, and that's definitely something that we need to be doing. And in the meantime, we really are at a deficit because not only can the right pump a lot of money and misinformation into countries, but they need so little to be able to destabilize a regime. You look at countries like Brazil, for example. It's like you have all of these groups that are coming after Lula, and it's really the co-option of fascist police and of
mafia
and
networks
and of the judiciary,
and business, and then foreign capital.
Yeah, and it's like, and we can't. The thing is, like, we can't rest on our victories. We always have to be understanding that
if you're on the left, quite literally, struggle never ends because you're structurally disadvantaged. The only structural advantage we have is that we represent the many, not the few. And that's, again, like, that's why Marx talked about workers. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was literally just a political recognition that workers writ large is the largest place, literally, where people who aren't owners of capital can exercise power. So that's the one thing. Everything else, money, material resources, access to, influence, propaganda, purchasing influence, always will be at the disadvantage of any type of authentic left.
And also, let's not forget, too, with Marx, it's very important that it's the potential within the working class to have the kind of class consciousness to be able to act in a mass. It's not necessarily that that exists today. So that's the other struggle of left-wing politics, is also building that kind of consciousness that can, maintain these movements, which is, what you were talking about earlier in the commentary, where it's like, the left, it can't just win electoral. It can't just be, we have so many ballots this year and that's it. They have to be able to have that kind of maintained social movement to be able to defend and to reject, immoral, unlawful acts by, a judiciary or a police state or something like that, because they're going to go forward and do it. And unless the people are mobilized to prevent it, unless there's international groups that are willing to intervene and protect legitimate governments, there always are going to be under threat. So it's always going to be a battle of maintaining our victories and striving for more.
Whatever happened to the Operation Condor years? Why can't we bring that back?
Argentina, Brazil, it's like you could just combine all the execution squads. It's like having Messi and Neymar on the same team.
It's like, it's just totally unfair. It's like, wow, I'm a journalist in Argentina and I'm exposing the junta flying people in helicopters and cutting their stomachs out and throwing them in the ocean, and I've escaped. I'm in a neighboring country. I'm safe, right? Maybe not. Maybe you're not safe. Maybe all the governments are working together because they're friends. Maybe Kissinger called and said, hey, this guy escaped from the country. You should kill him here. Where's my Condor years? It's like Trump's foreign policy equivalent of where's my Roy Cohn? Where's my Condor years?
Trump would have been talking about Operation Condor all the time.
That would be the that would be a real structural if they got up to the shit. Not that they aren't up to all sorts of shit. Of course they are. But if it was the same way it was in the 70s and early 80s with Trump, it would be amazing, because it like you would go from classified operation or Kissinger, it's a very operating in the shadows, and Trump would be like, yeah. So there was this guy came from Chile. They said, how can he get into the country? I said, we'll give him a visa, no problem. Plants a car bomb right in D.C. And all of a sudden, this ambassador, he's not a problem anymore. We blew him up.
Look, we're not so innocent ourselves.
We're not so innocent ourselves.
Look, I was going to say, don't leave Orlando alone, but we're not so innocent ourselves.
They blew up Orlando Terry right in D.C. I said, could you not do it in front of one of my hotels? But maybe you should. Maybe people want to see it. It's like a landmark. That is like the equivalent of when we go I Love Lucy's ratings have been pathetic. Would be like I don't know, like Nixon. Can somebody do a decent Nixon? It's like,
I wish I could. I can't. No.
It's like, by the way, we did a great job destabilizing Chile.
That's not bad.
Everybody says so. I met with the guys from ITT, great company. Everybody loves me. I love them. And we said, why can't this fruit Allende stop talking about putting the mineral proceeds into schools? Jesus Christ, man. It is just... I think Brazil is really important. And Brazil, I mean, you need to have solidarity, period. But it's obviously, I like and admire Lula. I actually, in fact, back when it was more time appropriate, I did a big dive with Anthony Pereira a couple of years ago on the structural problems with the Workers' Party and the failings of Lula's compromise. I'm aware of these critiques. First and foremost, you have to have solidarity with him right now because he's a political prisoner and is still a great fighter and bull for labor and the poor in Brazil. And also, I got to tell you, like, there might be some people who are aligned with us politically and their enemies are our enemies, and they might occasionally have them dead to rights, right? In a case like this that is so flimsy, and a guy who is so conciliatory, that is some of the most emboldened fascism I think you can see in modern politics.
It's also not too dissimilar from Bill Clinton, right?
I mean, Lula was a lot better for working poor people than Bill Clinton.
Well, that's what actually that kind
radically better. Although
that kind of proves
Bill
the
Clinton,
point, right?
yes, Bill Clinton, the right treated Bill Clinton like a communist,
Yeah,
even though he was a moderate Republican.
Right.
That's exactly right.
And they just went completely crazy because, like,
Right.
I think part of those people weren't expecting to lose the fucking White House and power, so they just spent we act like Trump or even the Merrick Garland thing is new in politics, but you can't go 5 years without like basic criminality from the Republican Party. Like,
That's exactly right.
The Bush versus Gore, the entire like Lewinsky shit was all like a fishing expedition. Like this is like a boxing match. It literally is. It's not West Wing. It never was. And now it's just I feel like part of this is just that like a hyper normalization in that like this is actually a normal thing that we're just having to get used to really fast because you can't hide it as easily as you could before.
That's exactly right. Now let's do a little bit of positivity. We're going to go to the shout out, and of course, Matt, I'm going to request that we play the full DJ Danarchy track.
And we're back.
Danarchy.
I don't want to get greedy, but if Danarchy could give us a shout out beat, that would be ill.
Top of the line professionalism.
Let's get to the shout out. Shout out.
Creepy.
Shout out.
Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible.
Shout out. What?
This is crazy.
Shout out.
This is out of control.
Shout out.
That's creepy.
Shout out.
That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird.
Shout out. Why didn't you keep the Pusha T on before?
It was too distracting. The drum. The
Let me tell you something, man. That two quick TMBS side notes. You can put it under me. I'm a professional. Two TMBS side notes. Number one, everybody in this office needs to be able to talk about the Atlas Network and exposing global fascism bedded by Pusha T. That's number one. And number two, in that B-roll footage where Lula pulled that baby up,
we can go back to that.
Can you pull that back for a second? Because this might be a special shout out here to the TMBS, the thriving and vibrant TMBS Discord community. So this is are we playing it?
Yes.
You want to just play it for a second? This is This is Lula being fucking dope, and here he is lifting a baby up. Okay, this is like vintage. Maybe we could freeze frame it for a second. I want TMBS memes that are built around Lula and this baby.
We really need it.
We need this. There needs to be TMBS and baby Lula baby memes.
The baby's expression is perfect right there.
It's, the baby's expression's so cool because the baby kind of has like yeah, I've done this before. It's fine. It's just me and Lula. That's what we do. Hey, he picks me up. He shows my diaper off. Whatever. It's fine. Just pass me off to Domo when you're done, buddy. I told you couldn't trust the fucking oligarchs, buddy. But we'll figure it out. All right. In the UK, Theresa May is in trouble. Several of her pro-Brexit ministers, including the ever hucksterish, totally full of shit, only charming by the utterly pathetic standards of mainline television, Boris Johnson, the foreign minister and one of the main snake oil peddlers of Brexit, has quit. The government is in disarray because Theresa May is basically trying to kind of thread the needle on appeasing her anti-Brexit base by essentially negotiating an agreement which would pretty much just sort of reaffirm the trade agreement, and I guess also reaffirm that, God forbid the UK ever get implicated by some of the positive aspects of the European Union, like open borders and potentially occasionally a decent directive on labor, the environment, or animal rights. Now, Jeremy Corbyn's in a tricky position here. I want to defend him against the lazy standard narrative about Brexit, which I disagree with him on in some respects. But here's the bottom line. They voted for Brexit. So I'm not comfortable with a narrative that's just like, well, the first step is you throw out the will of what people wanted. That's obviously number one. We're fighting that type of politics in every way, shape, and form. Number two, he comes from a left anti-European Union tradition, which is an honorable one, and has called all of the major things right about the European Union. The euro is a horrible currency designed on gold standard type rules, unnecessarily so, which entrench austerity, and we've seen the disastrous results and the horrifying punishments that the center has imposed on the periphery, namely Germany to Greece, as an example, as the prime example of terrorism through austerity. And he is right that while the European Union as a broader political project does have radical tendencies in the European Union, in the European Parliament, there are some good directives on the environment. There are some good directives on rights. There are, some real genuine liberal accomplishments, we can say. But it's a capitalist neoliberal project which did not build a Eurozone project built on, global flow of creativity, labor, and movement of people, as an example. It's built on very conservative macroeconomic principles. So there's a absolutely legitimate and important critique of Brexit, of the European Union from the left. Now, he's going to need to do a lot of work to make that a reality if he becomes prime minister, because like so many other things, that's not on the table right now. There's let's break this thing apart and the rise of the fascist right in Europe. And then there's Macron's like, sacre bleu, we can save it if we torture more aging train conductors. So there will be a absolutely necessary push for a radically reformed European Union. Recently on Illicit History, we spoke with an advisor to the Belgian Belgian ultra-left party, and he said the European spirit right now of the left is in dock worker strikes happening across the union. Jeremy Corbyn, though, shout out to him, he's getting closer and closer to becoming prime minister, and here he is having some fun with Catastrophe May.
Mr. Speaker, how can anyone have faith in the Prime Minister getting a good deal with 27 European Union governments when she can't even broker a deal within her own cabinet? To be fair, and I want to be fair to the former Brexit Secretary and the former Foreign Secretary, I think they would have resigned on the spot on Friday. But they were faced with a very long walk, no phone, and due to government cuts, no bus service either. I think they were probably wise to hang on for a couple of days so they can get a lift home in a government car.
Jeremy Corbyn is going to become Prime Minister of the UK, and all of the tabloids and the banks and the Blairites and the cowardly Labour Party members and the Conservatives are not going to be able to stop it. And Theresa May, what did I call her? I called her Catastrophe May. I like that. Every time we do UK segments, we need to each come up with a Fleet Street tabloid style moniker for somebody. So I'm going with Catastrophe May.
I don't have one of those quite now, but
It's fine. I'll give you more warning next time.
What's
Matt.
going on?
And we're going to do it with a Pusha T beat. So just be ready.
Okay.
Okay.
It's an interesting test case for what we always talk about. We can't get so focused on Trump because like the fascist government, I'll use that word, in the UK is similar to ours, is complete disarray too, and it's not somebody who's a complete idiot like real estate urchin.
No, Theresa May is not a mush brain who wants to fuck her daughter.
Yeah.
I don't know if she has a daughter. Maybe she does, but guys, this is really hard. Can I just have sex with my daughter now?
I will say I might be missing Boris after his resignation.
Really? What the fuck is the matter with you?
Boris is like...
Boris Johnson's not cool. Boris Johnson is like the quintessential example of like the strain to be cool by people who will never be cool.
Boris Johnson is like Trump in that his like power comes from inherited real estate, but his real estate is much older than Trump's was.
And he's clever. And he has a certain cleverness, just as Trump has a certain
They both have
funniness.
cleverness. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But I think Trump's, I don't know, actually. I think they're both assholes. I'm not going to say one's funny.
Yeah, fuck them both.
Fuck those guys.
But get on the field.
But Boris,
both go fuck themselves.
But Boris is, an absolutely horrible guy. But he did have that kind of Trumpian, like he'd go in front of a room and would just sort of be an asshole for 10, 15 minutes, and nobody could say anything. And,
did we play
pleasure out of it?
Did we play that Boris hot mic?
No, we didn't play the Boris hot mic. We can play the Boris hot mic, and then we'll.
But he's a character that could only really exist in the British system.
Well, that's the other thing too.
Just the kind of curmudgeon.
There isn't, just as like Trump really probably could not come from anywhere else besides like potentially Long Island, Queens, and parts of New Jersey. Boris Johnson does not exist outside.
I mean, but he's also the
UK.
decay. He's also very much an example of the decay of the British ruling class. In that like there used to be a kind of like grandeur into like your attitude.
You mean in the way that like they're whatever else you say about these racist inbred monsters, there was a part of them was like, I'm going to quote the Iliad.
Yes,
I'm not going to defeat Hitler. Versus like, yeah, Brexit, fuck it. That will make me prime minister. Okay, here's Boris Johnson on a hot mic.
When we come out, we'll be able to do things in the interest of the UK financial services industry. So we mustn't lose sight of that opportunity. Trump to negotiate Brexit. What a fantastic idea. I think how would he approach it? It is worth thinking about. How would Donald Trump have approached our Brexit negotiation? Actually, it's bloody good. If I was still editor of The Spectator, I would commission a cover story on exactly that theme. Imagine Trump doing Brexit. What would he do? He'd go in bloody hard. All sorts of breakdowns, all sorts of chaos. Everyone would think he'd gone mad, but actually, you might get some. So it's a very, very good call.
You see how reappropriating wealth and massively taxing trust funds is in those people's own interest? Like, Boris Johnson might have been somebody if somebody took his money away from him when he was young and forced him to do something with his life.
Dude, that's the conversation that they have at a place called the Institute of Directors in London.
Well, that's also hyper-normalization.
Bloody hard, mate.
Nobody knows what they're doing. They're all just riding a wave of corruption, greed, and status.
Yeah.
And they're idiots. There's no... That old, like, style thriller of the evil geniuses in the black cars coldly dissecting their opposition. It's not.
They're reading your mind.
Yeah. It's like a bunch of guys who just did a bunch of fucking coke in the 80s. They're just like, it'd be cool, if Trump did it.
But how much of that do you
just
think?
Like competing for TV hits. Yes, David Griscom with the defense of Boris Johnson.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't have a defense of Boris Johnson, but I just like how much of like the blistering buffoonery that we see from like ruling class characters today is just a part of the proliferation of microphones and cameras and things like that.
Oh, I'm sure there's a part of that.
Oh yeah, they were definitely all loony as fuck.
Yes.
But what it also strikes me is how much they all have like media envy. Like Trump wants to have his own TV network. He would definitely rather still be doing that.
Die for it.
I would trade 2 Supreme Court justices if I could be a programming director. And and then fucking like Boris Johnson.
Can we do The Apprentice except naked, and I could kill them when they get fired? I'll trade you the Supreme Court for it.
Boris Johnson is in a meeting that is. He's a very important person with a powerful position, and all he wants to do. Well, he used to, but this was a few weeks ago.
Right, he was foreign minister of the UK. That's a big deal
for incredible negotiations, and all he wants to be doing is commissioning bullshit stories for the fucking Spectator.
It's like, you know what I really wish I was doing right now? Putting together some like horrible speculative tabloid semi-fiction for the Spectator.
Like if I'm
about the situation that I'm actually supposed to be presiding over, which I created through my propaganda efforts, and now I'm involved with through my incredibly important job. And as I sit back and look on this, it'd be really cool to write a column about this.
It's like if I'm governor of North Dakota, I'm not gonna be like, you know what? If I had a fucking podcast.
No, that's funny. I was like, I was thinking like, I go home. It's like, I'm like the junior senator from Massachusetts. Like, what are you thinking about? Man, I just wish I could do a YouTube commentary on this.
I wish I could do I wish I could just lay out a good front page.
Yeah. No, I get all of that. But did you see that this fucking nonsense that Sam Harris said about it? What I would give to be able to do the sound drops about Neanderthals and make fun of that asshole for 15 minutes.
Like, let's make that trade. You can be in the media. Let us have power.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'll make that trade.
That is actually the perfect arrangement. Let the left run things in the interests of humanity. And because we, unlike you, actually do believe in a free press and free speech, you can indulge in tabloid garbage on the outside. That's the perfect trade-off. Although, as I always say, the core sort of political mission of the moment is definitely imprison Trump and free Lula. But that being said, see, that was a very innovative policy idea right there. Would Trump be open to trading a couple of Supreme Court justices for his own TV network? That's the type of can-do spirit that leads us to tonight's gulag, if we are ready with the music, Matt. Sorry, 1 second. Matt's too busy in his fantasy about being governor of North Dakota. All right, here we are. Sometimes I feel guilty about doing this segment because, as at least, most people who react to the Gulag segment are like, it's really tasteless. And those people are idiots, and they're humor-free, and they suck, and it makes me amused to read those comments.
And they belong in a Gulag.
Well, you kind of stepped on where I was going. But yes, they do belong in a Gulag. One person told me once, they reminded me of the actual horrors of the mass murder of Stalin, which we do not deny in this room because we're not idiots. And I thought, yeah, I see where you're coming from. There is a certain tastelessness to it, but that's actually why it's so good. And then I was saying and honestly, I don't really wish a gulag on anybody. And then I paused and I said, that's actually totally not true.
They can have
almost every person that what did you say?
The gulags can have PlayStations and stuff.
So we want a Scandinavian gulag?
Exactly, yeah.
All right. Well, in this edition of the Scandinavian gulag, where people are publicly shamed and locked away for life but get to play with origami and video games, we are going to talk about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, which is the enemy of democracy. And we're going to get to the dialectic, actually, that we have to strike with the Supreme Court. But first, we're going to have to deal with two examples of how absolutely not to deal with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh and the broader deepening acceleration. There already was. Not only was there already a threat from the Supreme Court towards our liberties and us, it already was happening. The Roberts Court had already gutted the Civil Rights Act. It had already gutted labor unions through Janus. This is a dangerous anti-democratic institution bound to get worse. Here is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer on Morning Joe. I'm sure he's on the case.
What do you think about the pick? What do you think about Judge Kavanaugh?
Well, look, President Trump is fulfilling his campaign promises with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh. He said in his campaign he would repeal Roe. He would send it back to the states. And he said in his campaign he would repeal ACA with things very precious to the American people, like maintaining pre-existing conditions. And he has now accomplished that. He's had two groups vet these nominees. One is the Federalist Society, run by Leonard Leo. Right. Leonard Leo has dedicated his life to repealing Roe. And it is a certainty that anyone on that list will vote to repeal Roe. We have the Heritage Foundation, which have dedicated their existence.
Can I just stop you on that for 1 second?
Well, I'd like to finish my... Okay, sure.
But I'd like to finish my point if I can, Joe.
You can't really say it's a certainty, can you?
Okay. So Joe Lieberman... Nice. It was absolutely not intentional. And I'm not even going to accept any charges of anti-Semitism on that one. That is a absolutely valid Freudian slip. So Chuck Schumer right there starts by going, you know what? Donald Trump's keeping all of his campaign promises, which is a really powerful way of beginning a political attack on somebody, saying that they're not lying.
And delivering for his constituents.
He's delivering for his constituents. So that's number one. And then number two, this person you never heard of is intimately involved in it. So if you would like, well, Joe, if you could, at least if you interrupt me, you could request that people do a web search engine, an AOL search, to find out who the person I just mentioned was, because most people would not know.
There's only one way he can double down on the strategy and make it work, is if he goes sort of like full QAnon truther about what's his name, Leonard Leo, and starts like seeding things into Reddit.
Leonard Leo is a globalist.
Oh, here's his address.
I'm not saying anything, but Pizzagate was real, Joe, but they got the parties wrong.
He's got a 3-bedroom house. The kid sleeps in the basement.
Leonard Leo was there was a thing called bubblegum parties, and I would recommend that everybody look it up because I won't spell it out, but I'm giving you breadcrumbs. So Leonard Leo was... And we have the documents. This was all documented.
That's the hardball we need.
That is the hardball we need. We just need constant implication that these people are pedophiles. And then what will happen is if I had to put money on it, we would probably find that 2/3 of them are. Yeah. So basically, yeah. We need innuendo and indirect accusations which elicit truth. So basically, what Chuck Schumer needs to do, and I just want to underline this, and we'll get to the dialectic in a second, he's completely failing at doing, even by, and this is what is so goddamn frustrating about these people, they're not succeeding by their own metrics, ever. The Clintons of the world, the Chuck Schumers, look, we're Wall Street bag people. We're not on the left. We don't have a serious agenda for the environment, for labor, for anything. But we know how to win. No. It is shambolic. It's not strategic. It's not even doing the job of seeding the types of doubts that actually could potentially persuade a Doug Jones, a Joe Manchin, these horrible people you're going to need to get to kill this nomination. And now, I want to elaborate on an extension of this, which really gets deeper because it implicates the whole cabal of them which is a column that Akhil Amar wrote this morning for the New York Times, or yesterday for the New York Times. A liberal's case for Brett Kavanaugh. Now, Akhil Amar is a professor at Yale Law School. I read Akhil Amar as an undergraduate when I was considering going to law school. He's a brilliant, interesting, liberal writer. He's also the type of cloistered, delusional, insane, demented, elitist, divorced with any remnant of reality, West Wing lab creation that's going to get us all killed. And this is what Akhil Amar says, among other things, in this column. In 2016, I strongly supported Hillary Clinton for president, as well as Barack Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Merrick Garland. But today, with the exception of the current justices and Judge Garland, it's hard to name anyone with the judicial credentials as strong as those of Judge Kavanaugh. He sits in the United States Court of Appeals for the District Circuit of Columbia, the most influential circuit court, and commands wide and deep respect among scholars, lawyers, and journalists and jurists. Judge Kavanaugh, who is 53, has already helped decide hundreds of cases concerning a broad range of difficult issues. Good appellate judges faithfully follow the Supreme Court, great ones influence and help steer it. Several of Judge Kavanaugh's most important ideas and arguments, such as his powerful defense of presidential authority to reverse federal bureaucrats and his skepticism about the newfangled attacks on property rights of criminal defendants, have found their way into the Supreme Court opinions. So essentially, what he argues here is that this guy has credentials. This guy went to the best schools. This guy is a nice guy. Goes on to say that he has obviously a much more nuanced view than Antonin Scalia of originalism, which is, that's very reassuring. And, he learned stuff from working for Judge Starr, for Kenneth Starr, and his sexual crusade against Bill Clinton. And then he goes on to say, although Democrats are still fuming about Judge Garland's failed nomination, the hard truth is that they control neither the presidency or the Senate. They have limited options, so they could try to sour the hearings by attacking Judge Kavanaugh and looking to complicate the proceedings whenever possible. That would be a mistake. Judge Kavanaugh is, again, a superb nominee. So this is all about procedure, credentials, and background. There isn't a single argument here on Roe versus Wade gone. What has already happened to labor, to civil rights, to the environment, to the fact that this guy has said some very disturbing things, which he did allude to, about presidential power, which, God, I wonder who might be interested in unlimited presidential power or not being held accountable for criminal activities as a president. That's really interesting. Sounds like good stuff.
Seems like we can make a deal.
I think we can make a deal. So, in that spirit, we sentence Chuck Schumer and Akhil Amar to the gulag. It is a type of delusional, rule-following nonsense that is actually going to ensure that there never can be any sort of return to norms. Professor Harvey J.K. has just entered the building. We're going to get to him in just a couple of minutes. We're running a few minutes behind, but it's very exciting to see you guys all the way from Wisconsin. Thank you for coming. And now we have to get, and also just to strike really briefly, there is no contradiction between looking at the structural reality that the Supreme Court is an anti-democratic force in many respects, and that even the strongest case you can make for it as a protector of minority rights is something that it is, to say the least, not done historically and is undermining actively now, even in the limited ways that it did provide for some of those rights in the 60s and 70s. At this moment right now, there needs to be obviously full pressure for, it depends on the state. Potentially Susan Collins, you can focus on the Roe v. Wade aspect. I think for people like Manchin and Heitkamp, the only way that's possible is to find some type of ancillary ethics issue or presidential power issue or something that they can use that isn't policy-based to just be like, I have some questions about this. So that's the dialectic of a much broader radical critique. And we're going to talk with Professor Kaye about packing the court, because FDR had the right idea as far as I'm concerned, among many other things. And in the short term, there's going to be the type of sort of micro strategy that if Chuck Schumer actually was the cynical operator that he brands himself as, he'd be able to figure out. But he is nothing. He is neither any type of crusader for anything, nor an operative. His only achievements in politics are having imaginary friends that he does focus groups with, literally, look up the Bailey family, and being a bagman for Wall Street. We have to get to the Griscom Economic Minute, if the music is ready, Matt. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Water boat, bro. That's an amazing Chuck Schumer segment to be like, well, first of all, he's keeping all of his promises. I would like to start by talking about how Donald Trump is not a liar. Are we ready? We have David's music. This is vintage BBC World Service.
This is very
this is what we're going to need to keep. This is David Grishcom's Economic Minute. It's a Marxist analysis of a current economic issue in the news. It's also an Oedipal drive to dislodge Dr. Richard Wolff from his position. David is coming at you, Professor Wolff. I'm going to be actually meeting...
Well, I guess like Oedipus, I don't know yet that I want to kill my father. But
well, I'm not saying anything else about the other part of the equation, David.
But let's jump on this.
Okay.
So, everyone's been...
Stop implying that I don't like Richard Wolff and let me do my segment.
He's going to fight me. We live in the same town.
Richard Wolff texted me the other day. He said, you could tell that little prick to keep his name out of my mouth. All right, go ahead.
Last Friday, the Trump administration announced that it was going to enact tariffs worth around $34 billion on Chinese goods. And for the moment, most of these goods are primarily industrial. China responded immediately with tariffs of its own, mainly targeting agricultural products like soybeans and pork, which the United States makes en masse. Now, we seem to be eking into what could be called the trade war, with both countries are threatening additional tariffs on each other. Yeah. But we're not necessarily there yet. I just wanted to talk about a couple quick talking points that Trump brings up a lot. He talks about the U.S. trade deficit with China. I think it's really important to understand...
China.
There is a trade deficit with China. It's 2017, it was $375 billion. I think it's important to understand that so many of our products now are manufactured in China by U.S. companies that we re-import those back into the United States. So these numbers might not be as high as many people are claiming. But regardless, I think it's really important for us to understand that the U.S. can maintain a massive trade deficit because of the fact that we hold the world reserve currency and Wall Street. Wall Street recycles the majority of global foreign profits, and they come back into the United States. And that's the debt recycling machine that makes that whole system run. Anyway.
One second, David. Matt, there's also mineral water in there if you guys want that too. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up and to talk more specifically, a lot of people are talking about trade war and really freaking out. If you watch MSNBC, it's fairly hysterical coverage. Yeah. A lot of folks are talking about Trump as if they don't understand his tactics or strategy. I want to say one thing. Short term, this is classic Trump gusto and bluster and nonsense. But there are financial interests in a trade war with China, primarily the tech and pharmaceutical companies, which want to destroy China's
intellectual property rights.
Yeah, because they want to destroy China's wall, basically, that has allowed a thriving pharmaceutical and tech competitor to the United States, which is virtually, especially tech companies, are virtually unopposed and have no competition. So that there is a financial interest for some members of the ruling elite in a trade war with China, even though that this is, if it does get bigger, it does have the chance to affect the working class and to hurt a lot of people. But it's just important to remember that it's the long-term goals of certain members of the ruling class that are really what we should focus on, rather than just sort of running around saying that, oh, Trump's an idiot, Trump doesn't know what he's doing, because there are tactics and strategies that are going on. They just might not always be apparent.
I'm going to use this as an opportunity. That's exactly right. And I also would recommend people obviously become a patron. And Professor Mark Blythe and I went deep into this on an illicit history recently. He kind of broke down some of the other dynamics around what's really going on with these trade issues with China. And yes, I mean, the big takeaway is this is a fall of wrong-headed policy, to say the least. But again, if your
100%.
only metric for looking at these things is Trump's so stupid, you're going to miss a lot of dynamics. I would like to take one split second to do an Obama being like, you know, China takes advantage of us in so many ways. On pharma, but also on military. It's totally unfair. So we're going to like do stuff. My daughters are aging so well. that's the arcing of the Obama into the Ivanka material. That's some bold shit right there. Will you restart the BBC music for me for just a second, Matt? I'm gonna do something for just 30 seconds, and then we're gonna come to you actually by playing 2 minutes of Roosevelt talking about the 4 freedoms. Sorry? Well, no, we'll get to it in a second. Oh, you want me? They're like, the 4 freedoms. First, we're going to have to assassinate all Republican members of the Supreme Court. See, you can't ask me to do stuff like that. I'll ad-lib too much. Tomorrow marks the year-long anniversary that we launched the Patreon campaign for this show. And next month, actually, will be the year-long anniversary, which is crazy. This really does feel like we've only been doing it for like a couple of months. But time flies when you're having fun and doing something meaningful. This show has gotten off to a really successful start. And as we say, next goal is 2,000 patrons. We're closing in on it. We're not that far away. And that helps us obviously sustain all of the content that we do. Grow in some ways. This year we're moving towards, we're working on a sort of limited live show tour. Also merch. Talking with my friend Kaye, who's a designer, about hoodies, hats, other things. I appreciate all of you. This has been, and it continues to be, incredibly meaningful, and we're honored by the support and the success, and really committed to what we're doing and making it better and better and better and better, even by obviously doing things like even just experimenting with the format, never staying complacent, constant improvement. So thanks so much. It's time to become a patron today. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. I want to thank David Slavic, Matt Leck, David Griscom, everybody in the community. There was also a kind of brain trust that I'm going to thank next month that helped get this all off the ground. And of course, all crew members. We're on the move. Join us, and we'll keep growing, expanding, and getting the right message out, forging these connections. We're going to transition now. We're going to play a clip of FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is in January 6, 1944, I believe. This is January 6, 1941. Excuse me. He was passed away by 1944. This 44 was the Economic Bill of Rights one. This is the 4 freedoms. President Roosevelt, January 6, 1941. He's talking about the 4 freedoms. This is a little over 2 minutes, and then we're going to return with Professor Harvey Kaye.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept. There can be no end save victory.
Welcome back, and joining us now is Professor Harvey J. Kaye. He's the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He's the author of Thomas Paine and the Promise of America and the Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Thanks for being here, Professor.
It's great to be here. And I think I'm going to end up holding the record of the person who's come the furthest to be in the studio.
This is incredibly impressive. Although I have to say, Gene Bajlan did come from Missouri.
Did he fly in?
Has Corey been in?
He flew in. Corey has been in. Corey came from Oregon.
I drove in.
Oh, this is a drive, so you win. Is he all good? I like the laid back posture here, but is he getting on mic enough?
A little bit up there.
Okay.
You need it closer?
Yeah, you need to be a little bit closer.
Your camera's right there.
And your camera's right here.
Yeah,
you got a camera. Get your own camera. So, before...
Am I close enough or not?
No, this is good. That sounds good to me. What do you guys... What's going on over here? Is this part of the broader...
I'm just going to adjust the...
Doing some, like... I like this. This show is like the Japanese industrial management method from the 80s. Constant improvement, constant innovation, ready to deliver service. I love it.
From Martha's Vineyard, and I was thinking in solidarity with those who are going after Alan Dershowitz.
Who are my question about that thing is like, when was Alan Dershowitz not like ostracized by any decent person?
Oh, I actually remember a time. I'm 68. I can remember.
What a horrible human being. But he was hanging on Jeffrey Epstein's plane. Now, I'm not saying we don't know that he did anything. But I'm just saying, this guy's. He's an ardent promoter of Israel, no matter what it does. He's explicitly a defender of Israeli human rights abuses. And if you want to go on the more, right-wing end, he helped get O.J. Simpson off. And he hung out with Jeffrey Epstein. The guy's a scumbag.
I don't even know who fucking Jeffrey Epstein is.
Oh.
I feel you're going to make me like Alex Jones here. But look up Lolita Express. No, Jeffrey Epstein is a financier. I think he was convicted of one charge in Florida, which involved abusing an underage. And I would like somebody to look this up for me. But it was a Florida charge where he was convicted of abusing an underage woman. And he's one of these guys, I don't know exactly, I think he had a hedge, but it's kind of questionable. And he had a jet hung out with and flew around everybody from Trump to Clinton to Dershowitz.
Well, that's the point, right? Like, it wasn't just Dershowitz, it was a lot of people.
If one were to incline to think in a certain way, one might think, very interesting that Jeffrey Epstein is basically fine today and no more stories have come out. Perhaps because he's had a sort of endless amount of wealthy and influential people on these jets with him at the private party in his private island. Now, we don't know anything, and maybe everything is great and above board. But it's, to say the least, a questionable association. And in fact, Donald Trump, in a Epstein profile, I think in 2007, one of Trump's quotes was, "He loves beautiful women. That I will tell you. That I will tell you." So, I mean,
it's pretty gross.
Yeah, tell me, do you have any information?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rough. I don't know if I want to.
We don't have to go into detail. I was saying, does he have an actual addiction?
My Midwest, I grew up in New York, but I've been in the Midwest a long time. So it's going to upset my sensibilities.
Yes.
Well, of course. Jeremy, doesn't Alan Dershowitz upset your sensibilities just through existence?
I'm started the Alan Dershowitz conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say, of course, you can do it. Yeah. This is well, okay, we don't need to know the details. What was he convicted of?
So he had brought a 14-year-old girl to his apartment and paid her some of money to strip and. Okay.
Yeah.
It's sort of the story.
And so I mean, and there was a woman. There was a charge against Dershowitz, which he promised to sue the person immediately, but there was an accusation against Dershowitz as well. So I had no idea, but I'm just saying, I find this, when I hear this Martha's Vineyard stuff, it's like, it's great, but it's like a little late to the party. Like, Alan Dershowitz is a total scumbag, just even by association, right? I mean.
What am I going to say?
That you hung out with Alan Dershowitz in Brooklyn.
No. In fact, it was a free week in Martha's Vineyard. I'm obliged. I'm obligated to no one.
So
it was a contest.
We did a illicit history recently, which you called America's Founding Leftist, about Thomas Paine, and I really like in your work, this balance of obviously in no way sort of not being honest or real about all of America's, many failings and all the rest, but also that when we root ourselves in a radical tradition, wherever we want to position ourselves here, that we can argue and trace our own line within this country. It doesn't necessarily need to be outside of it. Can you trace the lineage of Thomas Paine to FDR and kind of what is this American left or radical project?
Absolutely. Well, okay, so let me start with FDR and work back in a way.
Either way, go whatever way you want.
So it's interesting to note that we played the For Freedom speech.
Yes.
Right? And that's in January of 1941. The United States is not yet at war, but Roosevelt has enough savvy and real intelligence, as in military intelligence and otherwise, to know that Hitler's war plans definitely include the United States.
Right.
And they even knew how he was going to do it, in the sense of go to North Africa. Yeah, we always talk about North Africa as a target of Hitler because of oil reserves. But it was also the case he wanted to come down to West Africa, cross over to Brazil. And don't forget, a lot of the southern Cone area was actually dominated by, sort of pseudo-populist militia types, basically fascists.
Right.
And the idea was to come across there and then come up through Mexico. And the Germans were investing a lot in Mexico in hopes of getting the Mexican government to come over. I can go off on a tangent now with Steinbeck, who actually reported on this kind of stuff.
Talk about it. I love it.
Well,
please.
Steinbeck, because of his commitment to the New Deal and because of the success of the novel Grapes of Wrath that both Roosevelts publicly embraced, Roosevelt invited Steinbeck to D.C. to meet with him. And at that meeting, Steinbeck reported on his own recent travels in Mexico and said that he was amazed by how much money was being spent in Mexico by Germans in order to cultivate public opinion in Mexico. And Steinbeck's plan was, he was urging Roosevelt to start counterfeiting German marks with the idea of just wrecking the economy of Germany at that moment. Anyhow,
fascinating. Okay.
So
yeah. So he's investing in Mexico. So he's investing in Hitler's investing in Mexico
because the idea was to
FDR
come up
has
and
this
basically.
Intelligence.
So you would be able to hit on the coast. I mean, the submarines were off the coast regularly. They used to be able to, they had to turn the lights. People wondered, what are they doing? They're turning the lights off in Atlantic City and everywhere else. But everyone knew in military that the Germans were right on the coast, waiting for opportunities.
In military.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
So basically, the idea was to line up a whole series of potential staging points.
Sort of like set a ring.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
And the other thing was that I guess it was Goebbels who said that it would be easy to defeat the United States. There were so many divisions in the United States. Not military divisions,
No,
but
yeah.
religious
Within
and
society.
racial in
Right,
society.
right.
That would be like, plucking a string and all the divisions would just literally break
And the
into...
Nazis were very influenced by the American South and those laws,
Yes.
literally Jim Crow in the
Right.
South. So they must have
Right.
also seen a natural
Yeah,
affinity with a lot of American
yeah.
politics. Yeah.
And let's not forget
And
that-
also, of course, corporate titans were supportive
Right.
of Hitler.
Well,
as
in fact, I mean, we could go a step further and
Yeah.
go a bit off track here.
No,
And
no, wherever.
Let's not forget. I mean, if you were basically taking a note out of Goebbels' playbook, think about Trump's strategy and tactics
Right.
for dividing America, okay, and whose interest that might be in, right?
Right.
So, these are things. I'll come back to that later. Okay, let's go with the.
So we're back to the Four Freedoms. So
Four
he
Freedoms.
knows the intelligence.
So
he sees what's
right,
happening.
and he's announced basically the Four Freedoms speech we listened to was Roosevelt's call to arms, even though Pearl Harbor's 11 months away in December, right, of 41.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is that December 9th, 1941, Roosevelt is December 7th, and December 9th, I believe it is, he goes before Congress and he does his speech, Day Shall Live in Infamy. And he then goes relatively quiet, Roosevelt. And his aides said to him, we're really going to have to get you back on radio. We're going to have to have you do a major fireside chat. We're going to take a beating, and we already were taking a beating in the Pacific. We're going to have to encourage Americans to believe in the possibilities of victory. So they looked on the horizon, and it was February 23rd was coming up. That would be Washington's birthday in those days, right? February 23rd, I think? Or is it the 22nd? I think it's 23rd.
I have no idea.
I
defer to you, Professor.
So they made an announcement.
Yeah.
They made an announcement. They said, Americans should get maps of the world. Every major newspaper, minor newspapers, actually ran a full spread world map inside their newspapers. So that every American would have a map in front of them. Remember, this is the age of radio, not the age of television.
Mm-hmm.
And stationery stores that sold maps sold out. So on Washington's birthday weekend, Roosevelt goes on air in a fireside chat to explain to Americans why it is that we are now going to face a world war on two fronts, East and West. And moreover, he assures Americans that we can do this, which, at that moment took some gumption, but
Right.
we know we won ultimately, but there was no guarantee of that. But here's the key thing. In that speech...
But he always had a lot of confidence. I mean, he
exuded confidence.
He exuded
Yes.
confidence, and that's another thing that's kind of that I wonder, like... I want to go off on a brief tangent.
Okay, but don't let me forget to tell the pain story here.
We're going to get back to trust me, I've got all of it.
Good.
I've got a great brain, Harvey. So
I listen all the time.
Thank you. I'm truly honored by that. I'm honored by everybody listening, but obviously people.
I don't get to listen
to
live. I'm usually listening late at night.
Oh well, then I don't. Then I'm.
You're not in the YouTube
I'm not
comments?
honored anymore.
What's that?
You're not in the YouTube comments?
You're not. You're an idiot.
Actually,
I wonder how much weed that smokes.
In the middle of the night. It's a Tuesday night, or Wednesday morning. I wake up in the middle of the night and I think I got to listen to something, and I don't want to listen to the. It's Tuesday. It's a new installment.
That's right.
And I tune in.
I love it.
I'm with a little pillow speaker under my, because my wife wouldn't be able.
Do you ever wake her up because you're laughing at the Obama impressions?
Are you asleep back there? No.
No. She's with me. She's great.
Right.
We've got a new fan. So, but it's not that there obviously haven't been. I mean, of course. I mean, maybe Table Kennedy, because that's still actually relatively close to Roosevelt. But in modern politics, Clinton and Obama obviously had exceptional charisma, which was not connected to the policies of that sort of tradition in many ways.
Can I interject for a second?
Yeah,
but don't let me forget, because we could be here all night, of course. But I will compare Roosevelt, Clinton, and Obama.
I want to get there, but I do want to get that. Why is it, with the exception of those of the just setting the confidence and the charisma of those three aside, you look at a Chuck Schumer, how did Republicans even stole confidence from FDR?
Right.
And you hear and you see because so much
Reagan.
of the complaint again, Reagan's the thief. Okay. Reagan's
and that's
the thief.
serious. I wrote a book about that. Yeah.
Yeah. because it's just amazing to me when you look at these people, and I was getting to this in the Supreme Court conversation. It's not. It is first and foremost a major political divide, but it's also just a generations and crops of these of people in Democratic leadership that just have no ability to evoke anything, even regardless of the policy portfolio. And and then you go to FDR, and it's like a rendezvous with destiny.
Yeah,
I mean, nothing to fear but fear itself. I mean, these things are said, but especially if you listen to the whole speeches, I mean, and as you say, in a context where victory was not guaranteed, where serious problems were going on, massive amount of human suffering, domestically and internationally.
But
anyway,
four different thoughts.
Yeah.
One, FDR's confidence.
Yes.
Okay. The confidence was because he knew American history. He was probably the history teacher in chief, and in fact, in many ways, and we can come back to this, there's something very, very much the same about Lincoln and Roosevelt, even though Lincoln was ultimately a sort of Calvinist, fatalist kind of guy.
He seemed a lot more melancholic.
He did.
Yeah.
He was, in fact.
Yeah.
But there was a fundamental confidence that he had in the American experience, and that's what Roosevelt had. But it wasn't merely the history itself. They had a certain confidence actually in working people, and that's the fundamental. And that's what the Democrats have not had probably since FDR. Truman more than those who followed, okay?
Right.
But especially FDR. And I could go on about that, but
so he tells them, so the maps are in the newspapers.
Right. And he returns to the idea, and what he does is here's what he does. He opens this fireside chat of February 23rd, 1942, recalling Washington's defeats in New York and the retreat across New Jersey. And he then segues to MacArthur in the Pacific and basically explaining this war we're getting into.
Guy.
Okay?
Great guy, yes.
Yeah, no, let's not go to MacArthur. We won't go there.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe really, right. Okay.
Look, one of the reasons MacArthur was in the Philippines was just to make sure he wasn't anywhere near Washington, D.C.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So thinking about, but here's the thing. Roosevelt goes through this very lengthy address to the American people, which was one of the most listened to speeches that he'd done on the radio. And then he closes with Thomas Paine. And he says, when things look so bad, before they crossed the Delaware, Washington had his officers read Thomas Paine's The Crisis. Common Sense was the year before. The Crisis, which opens with these are the times that try men's souls. And he goes on. And basically what he says, Roosevelt, is Thomas Paine spoke for Americans in 1776, and he speaks for Americans today. And this was the first time that a sitting president or a governing president quoted Thomas Paine openly and confidently since Jefferson. Others had quoted him but never mentioned his name because he was too much of a radical for them to bring into the public debate, you might say. But Roosevelt had this confidence about Americans. Plus, he'd seen what they had accomplished in the New Deal. So Thomas Paine is his guy because nobody believed in the American prospect more than Thomas Paine. And anyone who has not read Common Sense or hasn't read it in a long time, just get a copy, put it by your bedside, and you read that, and even though some of the language may seem archaic, it'll sound to you like a letter from an old friend, and it will revive your sense of what it means to be an American. And what Paine understood was to be an American was to be a radical.
Well, let me situate this a little bit. I was talking with Matt about reading your book on the Four Freedoms, and I was saying, the conversation about the New Deal and FDR in some ways is especially in the circles that we're in, it's gotten kind of muddied by a couple of different currents, because first, obviously, I mean, we talk about this less, but I actually remember when Obama first came into office, there was a lot of effort, a new push of sort of right-wing revisionism. There was a book, it wasn't the New Deal that got us out of the Depression.
A
lot of that. Yeah. So there was always been this effort from the right. Sorry?
Is it Alterman?
I think it was Alterman, yeah. So there's always been an effort from the right because as is sort of typical, sometimes the right recognizes the implications of even the most sort of moderate left reforms.
The right is usually in the driver's seat, and they've got control of the rear view mirror.
Right. So there, and then there was, of course, very necessary and correct, critiques. I mean, obviously, I think everybody kind of knows, even if you just did like a list of, well, I mean, obviously the Japanese internment,
the Jim Crow military, and the inability of Roosevelt to convince Congress to open the refugee list,
and all of the compromises too in the initial stages with the Dixiecrats, and how programs were designed in ways that obviously would exclude, many black people in the South. So we know all of this. Those critiques are essential from the perspective of an honest accounting of history, moving forward with universal programs of any sort. At the same time, what occurred to me, reading it, was that there is a certain overcorrection that has made us forget that. And it's funny because the last thing I'll put on the table is it actually kind of reminded me of my current defenses of Lula, because Lula is far from perfect, blah blah blah. This guy lifted 30 million people out of poverty. That just happened in the last decade. Right. So. Okay, I guess bring us back to the accomplishments of the New Deal, and maybe also address some of those concerns.
So don't forget, this is really key. Yeah. We shouldn't forget that Roosevelt had learned, against his own upbringing, to have a certain confidence and faith in working people.
Because he was an aristocrat.
Because Hudson River gentry, right?
Right.
But he was of the Democratic Party side.
Right.
Whereas Teddy out on Long Island, that was the Republican side of it.
Right.
Okay. So here's the thing. And in the 1920s, when Roosevelt suffered the onslaught of polio, Eleanor Roosevelt became all the more liberated, you might say, to get out there, so to speak. And she was coming down from Hyde Park up in the Hudson Valley. She was coming down to New York, and she went to work with the Women's Trade Union, the Women's Trade Union League. She was doing a lot of work, not only with wealthy women do-gooders, but with
actual organizers,
like
Rose Jewish Schneiderman, immigrant ladies.
You bet, socialist women.
Right.
Okay, socialist women,
right.
And she brought them to Hyde Park. And Roosevelt got an education. He also had something of an education as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, because unions had advanced during the war in shipbuilding and other areas, and he learned how to deal with them, how to not to deal with them as Trump would deal with someone. Right. He learned how to deal with them to make things happen. Okay,
right.
So Roosevelt is elected, and even though the likes of John Lewis had been a Republican, the leader of the United Mine Workers, and even though Sidney Hillman was a socialist. Okay, these are the United Mine Workers and the American Clothing Worker, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America's Hillman. Both of these guys saw in Roosevelt real possibilities for labor.
Yeah.
And Wagner, senator from New York, Robert Wagner, the senior, basically, as well as Robert La Follette Jr. in Wisconsin and George North, this became this really progressive force.
Yeah.
Now, what really makes it happen, however, is not just FDR. It's that FDR knew there was no way you were going to make the New Deal work if you didn't have people mobilized, not just for labor, but to organize and make demands. And really, the best line is one very few people know. It was 1935, I believe. They had felt a certain success in passing laws, the Social Security Act, and the National Labor Relations Act, and a host of other things under the WPA was enacted and so on.
Right.
Now, here's the thing.
Which I just keep wanting to underline. I guess the experience I had reading your book, and this isn't a tangent. I just want to underline it.
Okay.
Again, it doesn't for a second take away all of the critiques and conversations that we can have about this and learn, and even just our politics, because in some ways my politics are certainly to the left of this. But just reminding people that, you went from a depression, an oligarchy, and this guy, and through movements and through policy, things like public works project. I mean, just this mass energy and optimism an empowerment of people that
Which-
materially improved millions of lives. It happened.
People are
And people
still
need to be
enjoying and
remembered.
benefiting from this
And
stuff.
we still, and every single thing that we
Right.
look at that has some vague foundation of what's right about our society,
Yeah.
almost all of it from a policy sense goes back to
Right.
the New Deal.
So here's the line, Roosevelt.
Yeah.
In 1935,
Yeah.
first of all, his cabinet officers and sub-cabinet officers, he told them to get out there and tell Americans to organize.
Right.
And in one speech, he said, new laws do not bring the millennium. In other words, you're going to have to fight for this stuff.
Right.
National Labor Relations Act said the government would back workers. Workers themselves had to organize. They had to confront corporate bosses. They had to
Right.
confront capital. Some died. Robert La Follette Jr. went out and organized labor investigations that revealed that major corporations, every major corporation, was stockpiling weapons, major weapons. I mean, mini armies in order to fight off labor if they had to.
Yep.
Okay, and this exposed that kind of thing. So what Roosevelt did, look, again, we know the sins.
Right.
But let's not forget what Roosevelt does in alliance with labor is he
Right.
creates a new America. In essence, that comes to fruition after his death. It's in the GI Bill and elsewhere. We on the left may not have liked it, calling it a middle-class society. But I can tell you, most Americans would love to have a middle-class society today.
No doubt about
okay?
that. That's completely inarguable.
The foundations are laid in the New Deal and the war effort. But here's the other thing, because I had a feeling you were moving in a certain direction I wanted to take up, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay? We know the sins. So we know the sins of Jim Crow. We know the sins of the Japanese internment. We know the sins of failing to allow Jews to move, to immigrate on a scale of a refugee scale. But here's the thing. When World War II came, every one of the groups that we might think might have had reason to be skeptical actually serves at a higher rate, where possible, than the average white Protestant American.
Right.
Now, why did they do that? Because they believed in America, and they had no intention of being excluded from what America could be. Because, I mean, again...
That also led to the double V, which is a very important civil rights.
Right.
Defeat fascism abroad and defeat fascism at home.
You bet.
By defeating segregation and structural racism. And I mean that was literally that was what returning and that was also a rallying cry of A. Philip Randolph and the great black labor
I'm glad you brought up A.
leaders.
Philip Randolph, because there's a great moment.
Very important
There's this
figure.
great moment where Randolph and Roosevelt meet.
Yeah.
Which is not just telling for the moment, it tells you exactly how Roosevelt and Randolph understood each other. And it's this. So in early 1941, when Randolph heard the Four Freedoms speech, he realized that this might be the opportunity to mobilize African Americans to truly demand the desegregation of the defense industries and possibly even the military. So he launches what we come to know of as the March on Washington movement, which actually, the march never occurs until 1963, when Rustin and Randolph together, with Reuther's help, organized the March
And that's
on
the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, which is you're going to end American apartheid, and we're going to be a part fully of America's social democracy.
Right, that's right.
Which is
So-
the other main part of this
Right.
that Adolf Reed writes.
Right. So he announces this, and he also announces that the march will only be by African Americans.
Right.
Okay. Now he starts saying we're going to bring 10,000 blacks to Washington D.C. Now this was unsettling to Roosevelt. He didn't fear African Americans coming. He feared what whites would do to African Americans. Because let's not also forget, Washington, D.C. was a legally segregated city. Woodrow Wilson had segregated Washington, D.C. So Roosevelt asks Eleanor to please meet with Randolph. They all knew each other.
Right.
He said, meet with Randolph. You've got to talk him out of this. This could be a bloodbath. Eleanor comes back from the meeting and says, I can't talk him out of it. Now, again, this is as the story's told. I have a feeling there are other things going on. So Roosevelt invites Randolph to the White House, and he's accompanied by Walter White, who was then the head of the NAACP. They're sitting in the Oval Office, and they're schmoozing, and eventually Roosevelt gets around to saying, so how many are you going to bring to Washington? And without skipping a beat, Randolph said 100,000, 10 times the number. and Roosevelt at least pretended, or probably was a bit shaken. He turns to White and he said, what did he just say? And White affirms the number,
Right.
100,000.
Right.
Well, then I guess we have to do something. And he signs the executive order and an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practice Commission, which is to desegregate the defense industries. Now, it didn't create black job equality.
Right.
But it was a major,
right.
It was a radical
step.
step in
Right.
a fashion. Now, here's the thing. The story usually ends there. But when Randolph left, apparently he wrote to a relative or he was saying to Walter White, forgive me for not remembering, but he does say, I knew before we went in the Oval Office we had won. Now, they didn't push for the desegregation of the military, but they did push for the desegregation of the defense industries. He said, I knew that because he understood Roosevelt. He knew that Roosevelt needed to meet like that so that it would look to Congress like we had no choice.
Right.
Okay? In other words, not unlike Johnson and King meeting.
Right.
And he said to him, you're going to have to stay in the streets.
Right.
Okay? I mean, that's what good leadership is about. Okay? You know how to mobilize and make those kinds of alliances. And King was smart enough to know whatever the hell was wrong with Johnson, this is going to work and we're going to pursue it. And Randolph had felt the same. So if you then look at the war effort, I mean, even 22,000 Japanese Americans served in the military. My best friend who passed away recently, his father, my friend was born in a camp in Arkansas, an internment camp. His father was in the military, Japanese American, okay? The 442nd, which was the most decorated combat unit of World War II in the American military. Then you can go right down the list. Mexican Americans, 400,000. Jewish Americans served out of proportion to their numbers in the population. The African Americans were limited by quota to 1 million. But the point was, why did they weren't stupid.
Right.
They saw the promise that they were fighting for, even if others were prepared to deny it. And I think that's the thing. We dishonor them if we only think about the sins and fail to realize the struggles.
Right. Right.
Sorry, I get all,
No, it's good. That's good content, man. The passion. On this flip side, I want to, before we close the top part of the show, there's two other grounds I want to cover briefly, and we'll get back to. I want to get to Bernie and the Democratic Party, but the other part that I think was very important that you touch on in your book, and maybe you could just don't necessarily need it's not the main focus. But
I won't give a lecture.
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
You can lecture as much as you want. I just don't want to put you on the spot for additional information if you don't have it. But starting in the 30s, it wasn't just that there was a right-wing pushback towards Roosevelt. It was actually the early mechanics of everything we see today. Like, the modern right, to me, so much is essentially a sort of propaganda and PR apparatus. So even if you look at things like Turning Points USA, it's, campus freedom. This is just oligarchs funding some low-rate propagandists to undermine education.
You can a lot of schools get paid to do that kind of stuff.
Right. And this goes back. You talk about how that the corporate sector. This is when they started drumming together the earliest sort of lobbying groups and PR efforts, and sort of the building blocks of the bugaboos and mythologies and lies go back to this time.
A whole series of thoughts coming to mind.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, the wealthiest Americans in 1932, in the campaign that year, probably wanted a Roosevelt victory.
Right.
I'll explain why, okay? One, because they don't know what the hell they were going to do with Hoover, but that's beside the point right now. The point is that they feared the possibility of very high taxes being necessary to lift Americans out of the Great Depression. And they figured, Roosevelt wins, prohibition will end. We'll tax booze.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Now, these guys, the DuPonts and others, they were, I forgot, I can use four-letter words.
You can always use four-letter words.
So they were pissed.
Right.
Okay, they're pissed.
Oh, I thought you were going to go for something really good.
I do that all the time.
Oh,
I won't let you down. I'll do the other words, too.
Yeah, I was excited. Okay. Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're pissed.
Anything like to say about Alan Dershowitz before we proceed?
Okay. So they're pissed.
Yes.
So they're pissed because they not only prohibition comes to an end, but Roosevelt's still going to raise their taxes.
Right.
So they organized the American Liberty League.
Already a good tip. Every time you hear liberty or freedom, pretty much unfortunately, that there's an evil group behind it, at least in an American context.
Okay.
Maybe overseas, if it's the liberation.
Be careful,
of
don't
whatever.
go too far. Remember, it's the 4 freedoms I'm here on about.
But that's the speech
Okay.
in the book. I'm talking
Okay.
about lobbying groups.
Okay, so they organize, and they spend millions.
Yes.
On radio shows, on pamphlets, on newsreels, on what's the old thing? Film strips. I mean, they're going all out. The only thing is, they couldn't get a grassroots movement going.
Right.
Working people were not going to be. They weren't going to do it. So it collapses. Now, the other thing they tried to do is they tried to launch a third party down south in particular.
Called No Labels? No. Yes.
Actually, the name for it was the grassroots party. I just blanked on it.
They call it, or the Serve America Party.
Well, I got to tell you that they had their folks out there.
Right.
Huey Long, they had lots of folks out there who might have sounded somewhat radical, but they could underwrite these guys because these guys they couldn't win. The third party wasn't going to win.
Right, but they could.
But they could take votes away from Roosevelt. Right. And they used race heavily.
Right.
There's a cartoon they distributed widely of Eleanor and Franklin out in front of the White House, and basically was, I'll kiss the N-words, you kiss the Jews, we'll stay in the White House as long as we choose. They were making it out as if the Roosevelts were the Jewish and black president and first lady.
If only it were. But so, yeah,
So,
and,
yeah,
and that
so this
goes
is- it
through
sets the example.
Ronald Reagan getting his start in politics. Being
And the honest thing is that
for-
Roosevelt had been a New Deal Democrat.
Right.
He was
Or Reagan had been, yeah.
Sorry, Reagan had been a New
Right.
Deal Democrat. He was famous at Hollywood parties for being able to, hey, you and he would have gotten along well. You and he would have gotten along well because he was famous for being able to do impressions of FDR in particular.
Oh, yeah.
And, and he knew the 4 freedom of speech. Look.
I had actually a story that I read about Reagan once was that in the 50s he was shopping for a seat to run for in around Southern California, and at the time he was still a New Deal Democrat, and they passed on him because they thought he was too liberal.
Quite possibly. He was he went with Roosevelt, and
it's
he
quite
went with
a
Truman.
depressing one,
Yeah.
right? So, final thread before we close this part of the show. I want you to touch on, what happened from FDR to Clinton.
Yeah.
I think Obama is a much more defensible figure, but there still is the neoliberal turn, obviously.
Yes, decidedly.
And then I want you to introduce Bernie Sanders and Eugene Debs into the mix. But we'll get to that sec. Yeah, you can handle all this. You keep talking. That's all you got.
No,
this.
I can handle it, but I don't know what time.
You're doing great. We got some time.
Good.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So Roosevelt, they didn't use the term. He redefined liberalism in America, which was our rendition of social democracy.
Right.
Okay, and in many ways, I'll make this case. There's a piece I did for Bill Moyers on the Moyers and Company website. Social democracy is not only 100% American. We were the pioneering social democratic nation state, which we can talk about if you want. But anyhow, but Roosevelt dies, April 1945. Truman becomes president. Truman's first initiatives were to actually pursue what was known as the Economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt had offered in his State of the Union address of 1944 to put more meat, you might say, on the 4 freedoms. Okay, and he pushed for national health care. Truman had, Truman was. I've always had reservations about Truman, Cold War, et cetera. But when it comes to domestic policy, he actually had. He is the one who really put.
Well, he sort of set the Johnson tempo.
Yes,
great domestic achievements and horror abroad.
Yeah, I guess you might put it that way.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's how I put it.
And moreover, he's the one who launches the civil rights agenda out of the White House.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So anyhow, the problem is the Republicans had won control of the House and the Senate, where they could win enough with Southern votes if they needed it to make things happen.
Right.
Now, my view as a labor person is that the demise of the real Democratic Party is the failure of the Democratic Party to defend labor. So we had Taft-Hartley in 1947, okay? Mm-hmm. Then you've got Adlai Stevenson running for president in 52 and 56. Talk about pseudo-liberals.
Right.
Okay? Pseudo-liberals.
This is a kind of precursor of the neoliberal egghead.
Yeah. And he didn't even read, apparently. The egghead, so-called intellectual, was not known for being a reader.
Wow. Okay.
Why Eleanor Roosevelt was so willing to endorse him, I have no idea, other than who else would she find, perhaps. 1960, Kennedy was not a liberal.
Right.
Okay, he would actually
Cold War.
He told people
center-right Democrat.
He came back from World War II and ran for Congress, and he refused to join the American Veterans Committee, which was the most progressive veterans group of its day. And in fact,
and he refused to condemn McCarthy as well.
His family was intimately connected to McCarthy,
and he specifically didn't vote to censure him on the Senate floor. And Bobby Kennedy.
Well, he said, he was out ill health. I think it was.
I had better things to do.
Yes. So anyhow, he has to be pushed in a liberal direction, and it was only so far that he would go anyhow.
Right.
On every one of those. The surprise candidate, you might say, the surprise president, and to this day, probably the most surprising figure in American history in some ways, is Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
It's the tragedy of Johnson. We know what that is. But the other tragedy, less attended to, is that Johnson was able to enact civil rights and voting rights, not only, but essentially because of the civil rights struggle, but the folks who lobbied to make possible civil rights, who made the Great Society War on Poverty first initiatives possible, was the labor movement.
Right.
And he said to them, here's the list. We do this first, and somewhere down the line was undo Taft-Hartley. And when they got to that moment in late 65, must have been the first filibuster he failed to break.
Jeez.
Now, I'll also tell you a footnote to that is that George McGovern, who had been a labor historian and now is senator from South Dakota.
Was it North or South?
I always go through that, and I think it's South
Dakota.
South Dakota. I was right.
Okay.
He was
South
wrong,
Dakota.
Right?
I was just guessing.
I was just kidding. I'm
wrong.
Okay.
I like that. That was good.
Okay. So here's the thing.
Yeah.
He votes no to break to end the.
Well, labor's always been a big mark.
So the Democrats
legacy.
are literally turning their backs on labor, and then McGovern led the commission that reduced the influence of labor in the Democratic Party.
Right.
And then Gary Hart, he ran a campaign for the Senate in Colorado, which was literally an attack on the New Deal tradition.
Right.
And then Jimmy Carter comes from a family out of Georgia that hated Roosevelt.
Right.
So it's the Democratic Party is constantly moving, already drifting in that direction to break with the Roosevelt tradition and turned its back on labor. Look, 1968 in this country is 1978 is where Carter abandons the effort to reform labor, abandons the consumer rights movement. I mean, it's
right.
Whew.
So then and then specifically, and then under. And I guess we could just say in different ways, Clinton and Obama obviously fall in the neoliberal.
Bill Clinton, I mean, if we reviewed the sins of Bill Clinton as president, Monica Lewinsky aside, I mean, the political sins.
Oh, I thought that was the cool part.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. No, I didn't think that was cool.
Oh, by the way, did you know that this guy who's been nominated to the Supreme Court was on Ken Starr? Did you already talk about that?
I mentioned it. He was a Ken Starr. I believe he also, and New York Times apparently they suggested that because he signed off on that Vince Foster wasn't murdered, that was a sign of moderation. It's like, the guy offed himself.
But meanwhile, by most accounts, he's the one who came up with the most lascivious questions to ask Clinton in the Lewinsky investigation.
Of course.
Okay. And we could go on. But anyhow, to go back. So
wait,
I
want to get this clear.
More importantly, it's, mass incarceration. You know where I'm going.
Yeah,
the end of the Glass-Steagall Act, which then enables
financial deregulation, mass incarceration.
Right. Ends the welfare as we know it, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I see a direct line between Clinton and the 2007, 8, 9 debacle.
Definitely.
Which can I then add one last thing? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
People always say to me, what happened in Wisconsin in 2016? And I said, hey, Bernie won the primary. Why do we assume that working people don't have memories? Why would they? How could they not forget what the Clinton administrations did? Okay,
right.
That's all.
Where is Bernie Sanders the child of Eugene Debs or FDR or both?
Okay, I voted for Bernie.
Yes,
I believed in his candidacy. I have some reservations now. I will tell you that. Okay.
My board, Matt. And you just said you have some reservations now, and I'm going to respond like this. Oh, no, you can't hear. You got to put on your headphones for the full comedic effect, Professor Kaye. All right. You have reservations?
Yes.
Okay, well, first, before you get to the reservations,
Yes,
maybe it is your reservations. I would like to. I mean, what political tradition do you think he fits in?
Well, I think he does. I think
Yeah.
he fits in the FDR. He fits in the FDR tradition.
Okay.
Okay, and I love the fact that he idolizes Debs.
Yes.
Debs, one of the greatest Americans ever.
Right.
Okay, one
Right.
of my heroes.
Right.
But here's the thing: Debs and Roosevelt both had an understanding of America, a radical understanding of America. Roosevelt did too, in fact. And that radical understanding was to appreciate the struggles that went into the making of what we have achieved. Now, here's the problem with Bernie. You will recall that he talked about being a democratic socialist, and in November of 2015, went to Georgetown University to deliver a speech to explain democratic socialism
Right.
to America.
Right.
And at that point, he recalled FDR's speech, the Economic Bill of Rights speech, referred to Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King.
Yep.
And then what did he do? We got back on the trail, and he kept talking about Scandinavia. Now, I got nothing against Scandinavia, and I think they are remarkable. I think social democracy in Scandinavia is something to be admired. But why the hell didn't he go back on the campaign trail and talk about the American radical, progressive, and social democratic traditions?
Right.
And
Right.
and he set himself up so that Hillary in the debate said, "Oh, here, Denmark again."
Right.
Right? I mean, I think he lost it. I'm not telling you he would have won the nomination and then the presidency necessarily, but I can tell you this: I am really fucking tired of Democrats who do not embrace the American radical tradition, because we're not going to cultivate an American progressive story today if we don't lay claim to the American progressive story of the past. And I can't tell you how often you start listening to these politicians. Look, I think the state we're in right now was predictable with the Republicans. It was unpredictable 40 years ago when the class war really heated up and the Democrats didn't engage it.
Right. That's interesting. It's funny. It's interesting you say that, because I think on one hand, I mean, obviously the ethos of this show is extremely borderless, and I'm very much I want people, and in the illicit histories, I mean, I want people to know about Kenyan or Tanzanian socialism, Michael Manley. I certainly want global dynamics. I wondered at times, actually, if Bernie Sanders, particularly in the context of the modern Democratic Party, in the positive sense, in terms of a multi-identity coalition, I actually was like, maybe you should also talk about, a little bit more Michael Manley or Salvador Allende, like a little bit more people that also represent other parts of the globe other than places that look like Vermont. But paradoxically, conversely, no, I think you're right. I actually think that there's nothing wrong with laying claim to who you are, where you are, your basic geography and your identity. You're running to lead a country, and you're claiming a certain tradition. So you might as well make the case that you flow from a tradition that wins here. Sounds right to me.
Look, in 1931, Roosevelt said to a friend, the Republicans don't seem to want to have anything to do with Abraham Lincoln. Let's make him one of our own too. Right? I mean, Roosevelt had this sense of what Americans would respond to.
Right. That's really smart. Right. So
he quoted
Thomas
Paine.
Paine, you prick?
No, really.
Oh, here's Professor Kaye again with the 4 freedoms. Whatever. You know what? I like Sweden. Fuck
Hillary Clinton launched her campaign in 2015 at 4 Freedoms Park here in New York City.
Right.
By the way, I was the advisor to 4 Freedoms Park.
Right.
The historical advisor.
Right.
So here's the thing. But if you listened and then went back and read the speech, you'd find she never actually mentioned what the 4 freedoms were.
Yep.
And never mentioned the 4 freedoms again after that.
Right.
I mean, the Democratic political leadership runs from the American past. It doesn't just not know it. It literally, if it does at all, runs from it. And I even wonder if they run from it because they're afraid of political correctness. Because we on the left have spent too many years in a one-dimensional critique of America and not picked up on the radical tradition. That's my sense.
Right. And again, there's no contradiction. It's a both. I mean, I've had this conversation a lot with regards to foreign policy issues. I'm very much, and I think our primary focus as Americans should be opposing U.S. imperialism, because this is where we live. But you can't understand, Syria as an example, without understanding every player there. And when you understand every player there, you realize it's a multi-imperial game. And so I think there's, especially in the political realm, where you have to just sort of, you can't obscure history, but you also have to just pick and choose what you're going to run with and how you frame
you
the
brought up
case.
Debs, as long as we're talking Bernie Sanders.
Talk about Debs for a second, and then we're going to go to the post game.
Okay, so Debs is defending himself from charges of the sedition charges in the courthouse, right?
Right.
And what does he do? He stands there defending himself.
He goes, in Denmark I could say this. That's what Eugene Debs did. I think Sweden does have a good system. Yes.
We're talking Debs here.
Okay. Eugene Debs was Bernie Sanders.
He brings into the courtroom to stand alongside of him Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln. He brings in the greats of the radical and progressive tradition in America.
Right.
In defense, and by the way, he brings Lincoln in to remind everyone that Lincoln opposed the war with Mexico.
Right.
He brings Paine in to remind everyone of the revolution that, had it not been for Paine, might not have happened. That America can only be America when Americans indeed remember who they are.
Harvey, JK, are you going to hang out with us for some of the post game?
I hope so.
Okay. All right. Here's what we're going to do, folks. We are going to go to the post game in a minute. We're going to take your Discord questions. We're going to take your calls. We're going to take your IMs. Tomorrow, as I said, is the anniversary of the launch of the Patreon version of the show. And I remember distinctly, it was amazing. I mean, right out of the gate, before the show even launched, we had several hundred people sign up, and that allowed everything to get flowing. And we've grown since. And it's fun. It's an honor. And it is actually a really serious undertaking. So I will... don't worry, I won't be too sincere too often. But there's a lot of work that goes into it, and a lot we're trying to do. Just even as an example, this past Sunday's Illicit History on the history of different, essentially colonial policies towards Latin America from the United States, with a somewhat of a brief respite in FDR, actually. FDR, relative to the other figures we covered, came off fairly well in the history. Good neighbor policy was better than coup neighbor policy. But this type of groundwork and understanding, both for global issues, global movements, also our own history here, and really the kind of full breadth of strategy, tactics, and ways of dealing with the predicament we're in now. Plus, it's also funny and really entertaining. It's a great show. So, if you haven't done it yet, please do join at patreon.com/TMBS. And there's many different options, obviously. There's an incredibly vibrant Discord community. It's a powerful community. It's a community that's starting its own activist projects. It's raised money. It's also just a very large group of people having conversations and engaging on politics and things they care about. And, of course, this show. So patreon.com/TMBS. Please do join today. Keep spreading the word. We're about 280-something reviews on iTunes. Those reviews help get more eyeballs on the show. Next week, when Matt Taibbi's in studio, we're launching a new YouTube channel specifically for this show. I want to thank David Slavic, Matt Leck, David Griscom, and everybody who's made this possible, including all of you. And we continue forward with our rendezvous with destiny in the post game. We'll see you in a couple of minutes.